Hello and welcome back to another episode of You Want to Do What with Dan and Julie. Today we have Chris Newman on, who is a professor of space law. Hi, Chris.
Hello there, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Yes, not too bad.
Good. So do you want to tell everyone a little bit about what you actually do, Chris?
Okay, yeah. I am an academic first and foremost. I'm a professor at English University, Northumbria, in Newcastle. So that means I'm an active member of the law department there. I teach law, and the law that I specialise in is the law of outer space, the law regulating human activity beyond the von Karman line and up into outer space. Regulation of satellites, regulation of launches into space, human activity, going beyond that into the moon. And yeah, it's an emerging area of law, but it is a really exciting and vibrant one, and one that actually has really increased in significance over the last 10, 15 years.
So where did this come from? Was it a love of law first or a love of space first?
That's a really interesting question, because the love of space has always been there ever since I've been a little. Before I can remembering, I've always loved space. I mean, it's always been there. It's always been part of me, and I really tried to do space, but I just didn't have the maths acumen and the engineering acumen. It turned out that my skills were writing and verbal communication, and that type of thing, and so. I, despite wanting to get in the space industry, I couldn't see a way in. And I had one or two career changes, and then I found myself becoming a legal academic. And a friend of mine said to me, he said, well, what are you going to specialize in? And I'd looked at him and I'd admired him because he was very focused and driven on the area of law that he was doing. He specializes in law and sexuality and queer theory. And I said to him, I want to be like you. I want to be as focused and as driven as you are. And he said to me, yeah, but don't forget, he said, the law I study isn't what I do, it's who I am. Mm. And that really impacted me. And I thought, okay, what's my identity? What am I talking about here? And, I'd seen colleagues who pursued conventional law careers, criminal law, constitutional law, commercial law. And I thought, well, what am I? And I thought, it's space. That's what I really love doing. And so I thought, well, there'll maybe be something in law and tech or something like that. And then I found this small area of space law. I mean, when I started looking at it, it was nowhere near the size that it was now. It was a few international lawyers, and it was quite a niche group. Now it's real mainstream. It's people are discussing space law in a way that they haven't ever before, really. So I've gone a long way around answering your question, but why space and why law? The answer is kind of the space was always there. The law was the day job, and it was just a question of combining the two.
It's it must be an absolute minefield to begin to sort of break down a case in space. How do you even begin to sort of, who decides what happens in space? Who is in charge of the law up there?
So in terms of actually the law itself, it's what I call a pyramid. You start right at the top, and the top of the pyramid is international space law. That's treaties agreed by nations, and those nations agree to behave in a certain way. Now, when we're talking about that, we're talking about very broad principles. We're not talking about, the operating system of space. We're talking about a lot higher level. These are broad principles. The principle of peaceful purpose, the principle that they won't take nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction into outer space, the principles that states are responsible for their own national space activity. So when we're talking about international space law, we're talking about very, very broad principles. And it's then given to the states to interpret how these are enacted, how these are operationalized. But there's another level as well. There's what I call the lower basement level of things that happen. People doing stuff. So a lot of things, and a lot of the way that law is shaped, especially in outer space, especially with it being so international, is by just companies and nations just doing stuff. The way I view it and the way I sort of explain it is, imagine a field, big farmer's field, and it's got grass up to your knees. And you walk across the field, and somebody else sees you and go, all right, that's the way to go. And they follow you and they walk across. And somebody else sees you and walks across. Before too long, the grass gets trodden down, doesn't it? And a path becomes clear.
Mm-hmm.
That's how space law emerges.
Okay.
Okay. People behave in a certain way. So you've got the high level treaties on one hand. You've got states and state law behaving in another way. And then you've got people just doing things and creating these paths. And that's how space law emerges. So you talk about cases. It's not really cases. There hasn't actually been many cases in law. Much more about setting down ways of behaving.
Okay. And how did you sort of first get into this world of space law? So you mentioned you were doing law previously, but where was your first sort of experience within space law?
So my very first bit of space was when I did a dissertation for my undergraduate degree back in 1995 on space as a manifestation of foreign policy. And it was very sort of, I look back at it now, very naive, but you know, it was the first sort of dawnings of what I did. Then I became, then I took a bit of a left turn actually, because I left university. I'd got a history degree, history and politics, and I joined the police and became a detective. And during my sort of my time in the police, I encountered what we call counter-proliferation. So bear in mind, the time I'm talking about is 1998. The Berlin Wall had just come down, and we were in the stage where a lot of black market weapons had started to come from Soviet forces, former, you know, Soviet bloc forces.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was happening was there was this concern about proliferation of weapons and rocket launches and things like that falling in the hands of terrorist groups. And I became involved in sort of that world. And it was there that I first encountered a thing called the missile control regime. And then I encountered ITAR, the International Traffic of Arms Regulations. And then I encountered the Outer Space Treaty. So actually through that world, the arms control world, was my first true exposure to space. And that was sort of stayed with me. I would have been about 23, 24 at the time. And so that kind of stayed with me as I left the police and I became a solicitor. I was a solicitor in private practice for 3 years, didn't really enjoy it, wasn't for me. And then I became an academic in 2004. And that's when I got my chance to really start exploring this. A couple of years later, I set up the space law module, started doing research into space law, published articles, and developed an expertise that kind of I've got now.
So what was your process actually becoming a lawyer? Obviously, did you have to go back to university, study an undergrad, master's or something?
Yeah. I did my first undergraduate degree at Sussex University in 92, 95. Then left Sussex, became a policeman, was in the police for 5 years, 6 years, and then left the police. Then I went to Northumbria, actually, where I'm teaching now. And I did what they call it was at the time, the postgraduate diploma in law. And that is, if you like, the edited highlights of a law degree. And it gives you qualifying law degree status. So I had my undergraduate degree topped up with the GDL, PGDL at the time. Then I did a legal practice course, which was another year. So the graduate diploma was a year. The legal practice course was another year. And then I was ready to go into private practice, and I applied for training contracts. And this will be a story familiar to anybody who's, you know, applied for a law job. Hundreds of rejections, and I just happened to catch a firm on a lucky day, and I got a training contract. So worked there for a couple of years. Wasn't for me. I mean, it was fairly obvious from an early stage that it wasn't that I wasn't enjoying it, and it wasn't for me. And then then left a training contract and took up a post in academia.
Wow. And how is balancing academia and the practice of law at the same time?
Well, I'm very fortunate. The university I work, we've got a wonderful blend of academic and practitioner. I no longer practice. I'm done with that. I'm an academic. But what I do is I go and, I work with firms in the space industry. So I'm much more advising on policy and regulatory processes rather than actually the law itself. With space, there's 3 areas to think of. So we think of the law. That's the actual, commands backed by a sanction. But that's actually a very small part of how we run space. The bigger bit is the governance aspect, so the regulation, what the regulator says that you can do. And then there's the policy side of it as well, the big picture stuff. What are we going to do in space? How long, what are we going to do in 5, 10, 20 years time? And so I advise on all 3 elements of that, but I don't give out legal advice as such. My advice is how to navigate the governance structure. So I see colleagues at university, and they're practicing solicitors or practicing barristers, and they're also academics, and they manage to balance it out because we've got quite a vibrant law clinic at the university. We're very, very lucky at Northumbria. We've got a award-winning law clinic that is almost like a firm itself. So that's how it would be balanced. I'm fortunate in the sense that I'm purely allowed to concentrate on my research, but my research is very applied to the space industry.
So we've kind of alluded to the fact that this is a growing industry and space law is very much in its infancy. Mm-hmm. But with, people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos pushing to go and colonize planets and head out towards Mars, this must be a really exciting time within space law to start laying down the groundworks for, what happens on Mars if something goes wrong.
Honestly, you've hit the nail on the head. It is such a fascinating time. I mean, it was great when I was starting, because when I was starting, it was, the early 2000s. But there was, a steady stream of things going into it. We still had the space shuttle, and that was going up, and the ISS was beginning to come into shape. So it was great. It was, it was a nice time. But there wasn't the commercial activity, and there wasn't the interest that we're seeing now. People talk about a second space race. I don't really buy into that narrative. But what I do think is space interest amongst everybody has had a real renaissance. We're rediscovered. We lost the magic of space for a while, but I think we've got it back, and we've got the wow factor back. So you're absolutely right. At the minute, there's so many interesting dimensions to space activity. You talked about Elon Musk, obviously, probably the highest profile of the space barons. There was a book called The Space Barons that talked about him and Jeff Bezos and the likes.
Like that, Space Baron. That's a great, phrase.
It's the title. It's the actual title of the book. The Space Barons is a really interesting book about how space activity has changed, even over, like, as I said, the last 10 years. But Musk it's fascinating, because when we think about early space activity, who are the people that come to mind? It was, John Glenn, it was Neil Armstrong, it was Yuri Gagarin. Now, name me 3 astronauts. You probably can't.
Yeah, it'd be hard.
Yeah. You've got Tim Peake, right? And that's about it.
What I can name,
right?
Yeah.
But you can name me Jeff Bezos, you can name me Elon Musk, you can name me Richard Branson, you can name me all of these entrepreneurs. So that's the direction that space activity is kind of taking. It's becoming very, very commercialized, and we're looking to use space rather than, or as well as explore it. And I think that's where it gets so interesting, because yes, we're talking about the colonization of Mars, and I use the word colonization advisedly, because actually humans ain't particularly good at colonizing. We only have to look at human history to see what a mess we tend to make of places that we colonize. So I think that's a useful warning to keep in our mind. But then closer to Earth, what we're doing with the orbits of the Earth, there's a lot of stuff up there, and we're going to have to start thinking about how we manage it and how we direct it.
That's actually something that we've spoken to someone previously on the podcast about, is the pollution that we are putting into space. And eventually you won't be able to get through the layer that we create up there. Is there, what is happening about that?
Well, this is one of the things. I mean, the trouble with a lot of space activity is it's I told you about the field, didn't I? The activity that happened, and people continue to do that. And I think that's what we've got at the minute. We've got the old way of doing business. And unfortunately, because you've got companies like Starlink putting so many more satellites up there than were before. I mean, I think if we'd have been having this discussion in 2018, I'd have said to you there are about 1,800 operational satellites. Right now, there are probably about 2,300, 2,400. Wow. So that's a huge increase. It's it's a massive increase in the operation orbital population. Now, Starlink have got a license for tens of thousands of these things. And even if a failure rate, even assuming a failure rate of 5%, 5% of 30,000 is still a lot of satellites going wrong. So we've got a problem because states don't want to limit their economic activity. They don't want to limit the amount of money that they can make from space. Similarly, they don't want to hand over sovereignty to somebody else. They don't want to hand over their ability to put things into space to an international body. But on the other hand, something has to be done. There has to be this coordination. Otherwise, space is going to get messier and messier, and there's going to be an accident, and it's going to be expensive.
Is there any sort of, I guess, in the US, there was a movement to create the Space Force. So that's the militarization of space. Are there a lot of pushback towards these things? And is there maybe a second space race?
So when we're talking about militarization of space, this is something that, again, it's presented as a growing threat. But don't forget, the early rockets were nuclear missiles. They just took the nuclear missile off the top and they put a satellite or a human on top of that. You look at all of the early astronauts, they were all test pilots. They were all former military. The military is and always has been in space. And there is, there's no real way of getting around that. So we talk about the militarization of space. It's there, it's happened, it's done. It's a done deal. Space is more of an enabler for the military. The thought of military battles in space, it's quite fanciful and it appeals to the science fiction body in us. But actually, space is much more useful than that, because space is able to coordinate terrestrial battles. And it's always about terrestrial battles. It's rarely about will there be conflict about space. It'll always be back on Earth. And that's the thing. So what Space Force is, again, it hasn't magically created all of these military space people. They were always there. They were just working for the Air Force, and it was just so what we've had is a sort of a rebadging, reorganization. But I think it's also an attitudinal and organizational shift as well. So in terms of military activity in outer space, there is military activity that uses outer space. There is military activity that occurs in outer space. And there is military activity that passes through space. So your cruise missiles, or your nuclear missiles, they sort of skirt into space, but they're not in space. So in terms of pushback from Space Force, there's always going to be, but I think it's very difficult to disentangle the military from space, seeing as how they've been there from the start and they're not going anywhere.
What is the life like as a professor and academic? Obviously, we've spoken about space law, but what's it like actually to be working in a university?
It's obviously at the minute it's really challenging because of COVID and because of the issues arising out of that. Trying to create a course that feels real and that has interaction and vibrancy. It's got its challenges, but I mean no worse than anybody else's challenges in the world at the minute. I'm not especially challenged because of it, because everybody's at this time is a horrible time. For me, the aim of the game is to make sure that people and that students really engage with the deep ideas here. I'm not doing a training course. I'm not doing I'm not doing a knowledge dump. What I really want is for students to grapple with the deep issues of governance and try and, come up with their own solutions and come up with their own ideas and really push the debate forward. I've been doing this for a number of years now, and it's their turn to have a go and see if they can wrestle with these wicked problems. So one of the things that I absolutely love is the teaching and the interaction with the students, because it's great to speak with people who are interested. It's great to speak with people who are fresh, who have fresh eyes, who have fresh sort of awareness of the legal principles and have a desire to prove themselves. So I really enjoy doing that. I really love doing that. I also have responsibility for research. So as a professor, my job is to produce world-leading research and to develop research relationships across the world. I'm very lucky. I've got colleagues across the globe. I've got colleagues in Australia, in America, in India, in South Africa. And it's great to build up these network of connections that can help develop your understanding of the subject. I mean, there's a tendency, we all tend to get very siloed and, very locked into our own way of thinking. And I think the best way to do that is to meet with colleagues from different jurisdictions who have different perspectives and different ideas. So my work is part liaison, part instructional, part, coach and mentor. It's great. I really enjoy it, I have to say, because it allows me the freedom to develop my expertise and to develop in an area that I find genuinely fascinating and work with people who equally find it interesting.
So with the future of space law and things like, like we said, colonizing Mars and the moon, is it going to be a case of copying and pasting the law from Earth onto the moon, or will we have to adapt and change things?
And on top of that, you've already spoken about the pathway through the field. How much of that is dictated by what we already have?
Great questions. And I think that is the real sort of problem we have. The humans tend to want to see these things replicated. We see a number of occasions where, well, isn't this just like the law of the sea, or isn't this just like aviation law, or isn't this like Antarctica? And I think one of the things that we really sort of need to accept is that space is different. Space is an environment that is entirely inimical to human life, and that it requires almost a different way of looking at things. So I think there is going to be analogies that we can bring up there. There's going to be bits and pieces that we can use. Standards. There's nothing wrong with saying everybody should use the same docking hatch or everybody should use the same radio frequencies. Standards are a good thing because it means that everybody can kind of work together. So there's going to be certain things we can bring up there, but there's also going to be certain things that are going to be very, very different. Things don't happen in space, certainly in the orbit of the Earth, the way that you expect them to, unless you've got sort of training in astrodynamics. The Earth's orbit's a funny and confusing place. So that the law needs to take account of that things don't happen in the way that they happen, on Earth. There's a lot more planning involved. There's a lot more forward thinking required. And I think what we'll see as expertise develops and as technology develops is we'll see the law playing catch up, because it has to play catch up. The law, especially with technology, is always on a lag. It's always behind the curve because technology is moving so fast. That's a challenge, because that means that human behavior can be, unregulated. But again, we go back to these basic principles that I talked about right at the start, these principles of space law, the peaceful purposes idea, the idea of no appropriation in outer space, the idea of cooperation, all of these that are at the heart of the international treaties. If all else fails, it's good to have them as the rocks, as the anchors to which you can hold the behavior.
If someone was to break these laws, who holds them accountable?
Again, this goes back to what I was saying about the principles and the ideas. On an international level, enforcement is always an issue. If somebody breaks a treaty, then there's pretty much not a lot you can do about it short of declaring war or economic sanctions. And if that country is richer than you, economic sanctions ain't going to work, and they're probably going to defeat you in a war. So enforcement on an international level requires a lot more. It relies a lot more on persuasion and diplomacy and political pressure.
But we've obviously a lot of these, a lot of the people involved in the space industry are companies, not states. So
it then goes down to the national regulation. And then the national regulators have the power to deny the license. They have the power to, alter the conditions. So that's how it works. The international law, effectively, international law says, states, you got to look after your own people.
Okay.
And then the states will say, right, okay, we're going to license your space activity. And like driving a car, if you act not in accordance with the license, the state's going to punish you. So that's how it works. That's how it kind of meant to work. It flows down. It flows down from the international treaty to the state regulator, and the state regulator will then say, okay, if you're going to launch that rocket, you've got to do these certain things. We require these things to occur. You've got to have good post-mission disposal plan. You've got to make sure that all your satellites deorbit after 25 years. So, that's how it works. So enforcement is a bit of a crude term, it's much more like oversight and continuing supervision.
So, say in 5-10 years' time, somebody's qualified, they're a space lawyer, there's loads of satellites going on, we're going back to the moon. What is an average day going to be like for a space lawyer?
I think it's going to be really interesting, first up. I think it's going to be one of understanding regulation and understanding how the regulatory frameworks of the particular jurisdiction they're in work. I think the bread and butter is going to be navigating your way through, like if we're in the UK, it's going to be either the Space Industry Act or it's going to be the Outer Space Act. I think understanding the next big thing, I think we've talked about space debris. I think the next big thing is going to be the scrabble for spectrum, radio frequency spectrum. I think that's going to be a resource that's going to come under increasing stress and increasing strain as we continue to develop. So I think understanding the way in which spectrum is regulated is going to be important. And I think it's going to be very much a question of liaising on a national level and on an international level. So I think it's going to be really interesting, and I think it's going to be a fascinating time. I'm sort of very envious of anybody getting into the game this time, because I think they've got a long and richly rewarding career ahead of them.
So what's an average day for you like at the moment? Obviously, I know COVID's going on, but what is it like to be a space lawyer in an academic field?
One of the great things about this is that, and I'm sure you've heard this a million times before, but no 2 days are the same. It may be that I'm, so for example, tomorrow, I'll tell you what my day is like tomorrow. I've got an online teaching session from 9 till 10. So what I've done in preparation for that, I've recorded a couple of lectures, a couple of podcasts, put some reading up on the virtual learning environment, and I'm going to go and see what my students make of the discussion. Tomorrow we're actually doing regulation of UK space activities. As soon as that's finished, I've got a couple of personal tutor meetings. So I'm going to meet and speak with the students and just see how everything's going. I like to try and keep regular contact with my students, because the temptation to get lost in the online world is all too easy. Then I've got a research focus meeting where I'm going to discuss with my line manager and sort of their line manager ideas for how to take space research forward, and what a modern research center looks like. So we're talking about the actual institutions and how we're going to liaise, how we're going to reach out on a sort of institutional and a national and international level as well. Then in the afternoon, I've got a couple of meetings with dissertation students. So students doing their masters who are pulling together 20,000 word research projects on space. That's going to take quite a bit of time, because we're at the structural stage now. So the research has been done, and we've got to build up the actual structure of the dissertation as well. And then in the evening time, I've got a couple of hours where I'm going to do a little bit of reading, a little bit of research to keep me up to date. And that's how it's going. That's going to be the day. So it's a great day, because I'm going to be dealing with lots of interesting people. Got lots of ideas that are going to be flying around, especially the dissertation meeting, but also the online session where I get to talk to the students, and we get to sort of fling ideas about regulation around.
Okay, and what would be some of the personality traits that you see in yourself and other academics around you that really help you thrive?
That's a really interesting question, and I can tell you what I think helps me, if that's any use to you, and because I think there are so many different skills. I think a good university and a good academic department is like an orchestra. It has varieties of skills. I think the first thing, my ability to research, my ability to be able to read and concentrate and focus. I think my ability to communicate helps. I think that makes a big difference. I also think that my ability to forge relationships and networks and connections, that's really useful in the work I do. And the ability to sort of process that and give it as a tangible output. So I think it's a whole range of things, and I think each person will have different levels of that about them in a good department. So there'll be some people who are really brilliantly analytical. There'll be others who are great communicators. There'll be others who are, like myself, probably useful at everything, but not exceptional in anything. So I think that's those kind of the broad skill sets that I would be looking at.
And on the other side of that, what kind of personality traits do you think somebody who's going to go into practicing space law would help them thrive?
Attention to detail. a fierce work ethic. I think that's something that, again, we all have in the industry, because I think it naturally sort of gets that, we're doing things that we're really interested in. So we're going to be driven towards it, and we're going to be doing it. But I think having a fierce work ethic helps. All of the very successful space lawyers I know are the most hardworking people I've ever seen. I think attention to detail, I think inquisitiveness as well, and curiosity. Those are the areas that I would really look for.
And then this question is going to have two sides to it. So what are the biggest positives for you working in the academic side of the industry? And then what do you think are the biggest positives for somebody that's going to go into space law?
I think for me, my independence, my ability to analyze the law and critique it and be able to say exactly what I see. I can say that there is a weakness here, but there's good stuff there. So I think that's for me, that's what I value the most. I also value the ability to research pretty much what I like, that if I have an idea and if something I see a particular need for research in an area, I can say that needs looking at. That is important. That's an area that people are missing. Now, all of that might be not very commercially viable, but it doesn't matter because I can do it. So on the flip side, I think that somebody going into practice, the advantage will be that they'll be genuinely working hand in hand with space pioneers. And I think that's going to feel great. They're going to be doing something that is going to be putting things in space. That's got to be a great feeling. I think as well, knowing that they have the ability to affect change in that sense. So for me, it's the freedom and it's the intellectual sort of ability to indulge my intellectual interests. And from the other side of it, I think it's the ability to actually physically make a difference.
And what would be some of the less favorable or negative aspects?
I think, like with any, I'll speak generally because I think it's we still have this what I call the giggle factor about space. People, if I mention what I do, you can guarantee people will look and go, "What's that?"
Yeah.
It's the giggle factor. You'd never do that to a commercial lawyer. You'd never do that to a criminal lawyer. You'd never do that to a constitutional lawyer. But I get it. And, so there is that. So there is the fact that we're doing pioneering also equals niche, also equals odd. And, that's there's no getting away from that. So that's one of the things. It can be, it can open you up to, I don't want to say ridicule, but it can open you up to people looking slightly askance at you and thinking that's not real. They made that up. So that's the big thing that I've found in my career, trying to get over that, trying to communicate to, I was very, very lucky at my previous institution. I had a great boss who indulged me on this. I'm really lucky at the institution I've come to at Northumbria. They're such a forward-thinking department, and they embraced it. When I told them what the idea was and how I thought it was going to go, they absolutely embraced it, and they let me run with it. Because I always say space law, I think, is like law in the internet was 25 years ago.
Yeah,
it's where there's that type of time. Like, I think in 25 years, space law is going to be as unquestioned as law and tech is. So I think that's where it is, but we're not there yet. So there's a lot of sort of pioneering work that's gone on by great space lawyers before me. And hopefully I'm carrying the tradition on of trying to bring respectability and credibility to the field, because I do think there's, as I say, I call it the giggle factor.
And how much of a demand is there for space lawyers currently?
Again, it's increasing with almost every passing month. When I started, there wasn't, or there was maybe 4 or 5 space lawyers in the country, and we all knew each other, and we all know, we all knew the practitioners, and we all knew the academics. Now I think it's really rounding out, and there's a number of students who I've taught. There's a number of students who've gone into practice. There's a number of solicitors there. There's a number of academics who I've taught and who we've worked. So we can see it's spiraling out, and I think it's only going to increase. It's the one area where I can say I think there is definite signs of growth, and I don't think that growth is going anywhere.
And how, once you leave university and have a career in space, or how does it sort of work? Are you mostly a consultant to larger companies? What does the sort of field look like?
It can depend what you want to do. There's two basic ways to do it. Either become a solicitor and go through it as a legal, through the legal advice route, and guide a firm through. A firm will come to you with a legal problem, usually a regulatory one to overcome, and you do it that way. Or do a higher degree, do a doctorate, and then pursue it through the academic route. That's the route I've gone. So if basically there's the two ways of doing it, either in practice as a solicitor or through academia.
And we like to talk a little bit about salary expectations. So we go away and look for some data and we get average figures. So average pay for a lawyer in the UK for your first 5 years, you're looking at around 54,000. But I'd imagine this is such a young industry with so much potential, and the commercial side of it's going to grow year on year on year, as we said. So I'd imagine the salaries you can't really give a definitive sort of average yet, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're probably right about the commercial law firms' salaries. I would expect about 54,000, because I think actually my advice would be, if you're interested in becoming a space lawyer, do the basics first. Get all the basic good stuff, the contract law, the regulatory law, get all of that under your belt. And which will involve going into practice and doing your various seats in the various parts of the firm. And then once you practiced, then you can set up your specialism. So very much for your training contract, go and do the basics, and then emerge through that. So I would think actually probably the figure you give is about right, but blimey, they don't have to work you hard for it.
Yeah. And what would be something that's not in the job description, both within the space law industry and for you as an academic?
The liaison between disciplines, I think, is a real thing that doesn't get mentioned enough, and is something that I think is a crucial aspect of the job, because scientists are scientists. They are not trained in the law. Lawyers are lawyers, and they are not trained in science, and yet they're both going to have to live in the same world, and they're going to be dealing with the problems that are going to happen.
And one needs the other.
Right, absolutely. And mistakes happen where one forgets about the other's expertise. So you can generally see that a project will, you go on YouTube and you look at space projects, the YouTube is full of videos of really promising space projects that came to nothing because the business case wasn't solid, the regulatory case wasn't solid, and they underestimated that side of things. Similarly, a lawyer needs absolutely to understand that the space environment is very, very specialist. It requires a unique set of skills to work in that environment and to make things work in that environment as well. So, I think there needs to be this sympathy on both sides, and that's something you'll never see in the job description either.
And what's something that you're most excited about with the future of space law, and what kind of impact it could have?
I think recently we saw the signing of the Artemis Accords. Now, these were bilateral political agreements between states under the auspices of the American Artemis program to return to the moon. This is a radically different way of doing space law to previously. Previously, what we'd had was big international treaties signed within the auspices of the UN that, led to these, I talked about the principles before. What we're now seeing is a much more active, a much more fluid state of affairs, where state A and state B sign an agreement between each other to behave in a certain way on a certain project. And I think that's going to be interesting. It's going to be really interesting to see how that changes the nature of space law, whether it politicizes it more, because, of course, you notice that Russia and China didn't sign the Artemis Accords, and it's unlikely that Russia would have signed the Artemis Accords anyway. So there's this politicization of space law and this politicization of norms. And I think that's going to be a really interesting development. I also think the increase in the orbital population is going to make it so that we have to regulate how satellites behave. So I think those two sort of areas are really interesting, really dynamic at the minute. And
would you still get into the industry knowing everything you know now?
Oh God, yeah, it's brilliant. It's absolutely fantastic. I love my job. I love working in space law. I love being an academic working in space law. I work with some amazing people. I work with some of the most intelligent, creative and gifted people that you could ever imagine to meet, and it is a privilege every day to be a part of that world.
Brilliant. For someone maybe at the age of 16, but just doing their GCSEs or so, what would be some stuff you'd suggest for them if they wanted to pursue a career in space law?
My first thought would be, and this is probably advice again that you've had, is as a 16-year-old, don't panic. Play to develop your skills, develop everything you've got, and find out what you're really, really good at. Because it's at that age where you don't really know and you want certainty and you're desperate for certainty, and it's not there and it's not going to be there. So my advice is almost have tunnel vision and think, what am I really, really good at, and be honest. Because, you know, we all say, oh, well, I'm not very good at this, I'm not very good at that, when we know we are. So develop an honest diagnosis about yourself. What can you do and what can't you do? You know, it's no use wanting to be a space lawyer if you're not very good at writing. But if you're good at maths, then forget being a space lawyer, just go and join a space program, you know. So develop an honest and open diagnosis about yourself and your skills. Not a time for false modesty, not a time for deluding yourself. So that's the main thing I would say. Make sure that you're available and aware of what you can do, because then you can shape your. My career has been one where I've been trying to navigate to where I want to be, and it's understanding what I can do and what I can't do that's got me to where I am.
Brilliant.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Chris. I've really enjoyed chatting to you, and it's been fascinating learning about the potential sort of careers in space law.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. And good luck to anyone who's listening who's just about to embark on the journey. I would swap places with you in a heartbeat. I loved what I do, and I'd love to do it again. So, you know, thank you so much.
Thank you again. Where can people find you on social media if you've got any?
Yeah, I am on Twitter at Chris Newman 1972. They can also, if they go on Google, they'll search and they'll find out my Northumbria webpage. You can have a look at me there as well. And that's Twitter is my social media of choice.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Chris. Cheers. Bye.
Take care.